In 1965, 23 patients were admitted into St. Mary's State Hospital in rural Pennsylvania. By the next morning, every one of them had vanished. The hospital claimed they had been transferred to other institutions, but no records were ever released. Families demanded answers, but none were given. Within a year, St. Mary's was shut down. Its doors were locked, its windows boarded, and the town quietly moved on from the tragedy. But 40 years later, when construction crews began demolishing parts of the abandoned building, they broke through a wall that was never meant to be opened. Behind it lay a hidden wing that contradicted everything the hospital had claimed. What was discovered inside would force investigators to reopen a case that powerful people had spent decades trying to bury. St. Mary's State Hospital had once been a place of hope. Built in the 1920s, its towering red brick facade and long white-pillared entrance gave the impression of stability, even dignity. Local newspapers of the time described it as a modern marvel of medicine, a place where those suffering from mental illness or long-term conditions could finally receive care away from the cramped county poorhouses. Families brought their sons, daughters, and siblings here, believing they would be treated with compassion. But by the early 1960s, that image had crumbled. Behind the hospital's tall iron gates, the reality was far more grim. Hallways reeked of disinfectant layered over mildew. The plaster walls cracked with age, ceilings leaked with every rainstorm, and nurses often worked double shifts with too few supplies. Former employees later admitted that overcrowding was routine. Beds lined up so tightly that patients could reach out and touch one another across the aisles. The food was bland, often spoiled, and patients sometimes went hungry when deliveries failed to arrive. And yet, for the people of the surrounding county, St. Mary's was still seen as untouchable, a state institution run by officials in distant offices. Questioning it was dangerous, and most townspeople preferred not to think too hard about what really happened behind its locked doors. That silence made what happened in 1965 even easier to erase. When the patients vanished, there was almost no official outrage. A few local papers printed cautious headlines. Transfers at St. Mary's raised concerns. Others repeated the hospital's statement word for word, that 24 patients had been quietly moved to other facilities for their own safety. But no editorials questioned why no transfer orders were filed, or why families had not been notified. The families themselves tried to fight back, writing letters, visiting state offices, even demanding investigations, but each time they were told the same thing. The records had been misplaced. The officials in charge had retired. The matter was closed. Within months, the tragedy slipped from the front pages. By the following year, the state announced that St. Mary's would be closed due to declining funding. Its doors were chained shut, windows boarded. The hospital became a husk on the hill, too expensive to demolish, too shameful to repurpose. And so it stood for decades, decaying brick by brick, its silence broken only by the wind that whistled through broken windows. Locals said the hospital was cursed. Teenagers dared one another to sneak inside, claiming they heard voices echoing down the darkened halls. Some swore they saw shadows moving in the windows long after the building had been abandoned. For most people, St. Mary's was just another ruin. But for the families of the missing, it was an open wound. Their sons, daughters, and siblings had gone into that hospital and never come back. And as the years turned to decades, one question remained unanswered. Had those patients ever left St. Mary's at all? For years, the story of that night in 1965 was told only in whispers. Officially, nothing unusual had happened. Yet scattered pieces of testimony survived, fragments that, when stitched together, painted a picture the hospital never wanted revealed. One orderly, a man in his early 20s at the time, later recalled that the ward had seemed strangely quiet the evening before the disappearance. Patients who were usually restless had been given heavier doses of medication. The hall lights flickered, and nurses were ordered to keep certain doors locked that were normally left open. He remembered a senior doctor pacing the corridor, clipboard in hand, muttering to himself as if waiting for something. By midnight, he claimed, a group of men arrived who were not part of the hospital staff. They wore dark suits rather than white coats, carried leather briefcases, and signed no entry logs. Within an hour, the entire north wing of the hospital had been cleared of personnel, leaving only patients behind those locked doors. What happened inside after that point remains a mystery. The next morning, those patients were simply gone. Beds neatly made, personal belongings stacked against the walls, medical charts stripped from their clips. It was as though 23 lives had been lifted out of the building without a trace. Families rushed to the hospital, some driving hundreds of miles after receiving frantic phone calls from other relatives. They were met in the lobby by administrators who repeated the same rehearsed line: "Your loved one has been transferred. Their records will be forwarded." Yet when families pressed for details, where, when, why, no one could provide an answer. One mother described begging to see the transfer order for her son, a 19-year-old who had been admitted for what doctors then called nervous exhaustion. The administrator flipped through a file, found nothing, and quietly closed the folder. She was escorted out by security before she could ask again. Over the following weeks, families wrote letters to newspapers, governors, even federal agencies. Most were ignored. A few received short replies thanking them for their concerns, but offering no information. One father, who had been a steelworker all his life, drove to 3 different state hospitals across Pennsylvania, demanding to know if his daughter had been moved there. Each time, the answer was the same: "We have no record of her." And then silence. Slowly, the families learned that pushing too hard carried consequences. Some were threatened with loss of state benefits. Others found themselves under quiet surveillance, unmarked cars parked near their homes, strange phone clicks on their lines. Within a year, most had stopped asking questions altogether. By the time St. Mary's was closed in 1966, the disappearances had been reduced to a footnote. Boxes of patient files were destroyed in a sudden basement flood. Local reporters who had shown interest were reassigned. And in the town itself, people avoided speaking of it. The hospital, with its boarded windows and locked gates, became a monument not just to neglect, but to secrets no one dared uncover. Yet behind those walls, time stood still. The beds, the hallways, the locked wards, all remained exactly as they'd been on the night the patients disappeared. And for decades, those rooms held their silence, waiting for the day someone would finally break through the wall and force the truth to the surface. For most people, the story of St. Mary's faded into the background of local legend. It became a ghost tale told by teenagers daring each other to sneak into the ruins. To the town council, it was an embarrassment they wished would collapse on its own. To developers, it was a liability, too unstable to renovate, too costly to demolish. But to Detective Samuel Whitaker, it was something far more personal. Whitaker wasn't even alive when the patients vanished in 1965. By the time he was born in the mid-70s, St. Mary's was already boarded up, its windows gaping like blind eyes above the hill. As a boy, he remembered driving past it in the back seat of his father's car, pressing his forehead against the glass, staring at the looming structure until it disappeared behind the trees. He used to ask his father why the building was locked. Why no one ever went inside. His father never answered. It wasn't until years later, after his father's death, that Whitaker discovered why. Among his father's belongings, tucked in a shoebox of old papers, was a faded photograph. A young man in a hospital gown, staring weakly at the camera, a paper tag tied around his wrist. On the back, in careful handwriting, was a name, Michael Whitaker, 1943 to 1965. It was his uncle, a brother his father had never once spoken about. The discovery hit Whitaker harder than he expected. He had grown up believing his family's history was unremarkable, a line of steelworkers and farmers who kept their heads down, worked hard, and avoided trouble. Now, staring at that photograph, he realized his father had carried a secret all his life. Michael Whitaker admitted to St. Mary's for what records described only as severe anxiety, had been one of the 23 patients who vanished without explanation. Whitaker sat at his kitchen table long into the night, spreading out the few documents he had: the photograph, a yellowed newspaper clipping with a vague headline about patient transfers, and a folded obituary for his grandmother, who had died still waiting for her son to come home. The silence of his father suddenly made sense. It wasn't indifference. It was grief buried so deeply it had hardened into stone. For Whitaker, a detective now used to unraveling cold cases, that silence felt unbearable. He had spent his career chasing answers for strangers, piecing together long-forgotten puzzles until the truth finally surfaced. And now, for the first time, the puzzle was his own family. He began with the official record, or what little remained of it. St. Mary's, according to state files, had closed in 1966. Its patient archives, supposedly, had been lost in a basement flood the following year. The state health department listed the vanished patients as transferred, but no destinations were named. A black hole where paperwork should have been. It was the kind of absence Whitaker knew too well. In his line of work, missing records rarely meant an honest mistake. They meant someone had erased them deliberately. And so, in the spring of 2005, Whitaker made a decision. He would reopen the story of St. Mary's, not as a detective assigned to a case, but as a nephew trying to find the truth about his uncle. He would retrace the steps of those families who had once demanded answers and been silenced. He would walk the halls of the hospital that had swallowed them whole. For Whitaker, the mystery of St. Mary's was no longer just a legend. It was blood. It was family. And whatever had happened inside those walls 40 years ago, he would not let it remain buried. What he didn't yet realize was that digging into St. Mary's would mean stepping into a story far larger and far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Whitaker's investigation began the way most cold cases did, with paper. He knew that before he could set foot in the ruins of St. Mary's, he had to see what was left behind in black ink. Patient files, transfer slips, anything that could prove whether Michael Whitaker and the others had ever truly left the hospital. He drove to the county archives, a brick courthouse with dusty windows and an overworked clerk who looked startled when he asked for hospital records from the mid-1960s. She disappeared into the back for nearly half an hour, then returned carrying 2 cardboard boxes. One was filled with yellowed admission logs, neat rows of names, dates, diagnoses written in the stilted medical language of the era. The other, meant to hold discharge and transfer papers, was almost empty. Most of the files, she explained with a shrug, had been destroyed in a basement flood sometime in the 1970s. The coincidence struck Whitaker immediately. Floods could ruin many things, but not so conveniently the exact records tied to 23 missing people. Still, Whitaker sifted through what remained. He found his uncle's name. Michael Whitaker, admitted April 12, 1965. But where every other entry ended with a transfer notation or discharge signature, his uncle's line was blank. Nothing, not even a doctor's initials. It was as if the man had been admitted, placed in a bed, and then ceased to exist. The same was true for 22 others. No discharge, no transfers, only silence. Whitaker copied each entry by hand, his pen scratching across his notebook. He had seen this pattern before in other investigations, when institutions erased their mistakes by pretending people had never existed. Next, he visited the state health department in Harrisburg. He expected resistance, but he didn't expect the unease he felt as soon as he asked for St. Mary's records. The receptionist stiffened. A supervisor was called. After a long wait, Whitaker was ushered into a small office where a man in a gray suit sat across from him with folded hands. The man introduced himself not by name but by title, Assistant Director of Medical Archives. He explained politely but firmly that St. Mary's files had been sealed under state confidentiality laws. When Whitaker pressed, mentioning that his uncle had been among the vanished patients, the man's eyes flickered, but his tone remained flat. "I'm sorry," he said. There are no records available for release. It's best to let the matter rest. It was the kind of phrase Whitaker had learned to recognize, not a denial, not an explanation, but a carefully chosen dead end. He left the office with nothing but the echo of those words and the unsettling sense that the man had been waiting for someone like him to show up. Back in his car, Whitaker scribbled in his notebook, "They know more. They're hiding it." Frustrated, but not deterred, he turned to another source, people. Through county directories, he tracked down names of former hospital employees. Many were long dead, their obituaries listing them as retired nurses, orderlies, or custodians from St. Mary's. But a handful were still alive, living quietly in nursing homes or with their families. The first he reached was a former nurse, named Alice Rowe, now in her 80s. She spoke in a trembling voice over the phone, agreeing to meet him, then calling back an hour later to cancel. "I'm sorry, I can't," she whispered. "It's better if I don't talk about those." Years, and then she hung up. Others were the same. Some refused to answer the door. One man told Whitaker flatly, "Don't dig into this, son. You won't like what you find." The further Whitaker reached back into the past, the clearer it became. The silence surrounding St. Mary's wasn't just neglect, it was enforced. And yet, in the midst of that silence, small fragments began to surface. A nurse's aide who remembered a night when the north wing was suddenly cleared. A janitor's nephew who claimed his uncle once described walls going up overnight. A retired orderly who admitted, after a long pause, that he had seen men in suits carrying boxes of files out of the hospital just days before it closed. Each piece was incomplete, fragile on its own, but together they formed the outline of something larger, a pattern Whitaker couldn't ignore. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase what happened in St. Mary's. And if the stories were true, those lengths included not just missing paperwork, but the very bricks and mortar of the building itself. Whitaker closed his notebook with a heavy hand. He had started with a single family mystery, his uncle's disappearance. But now, he was certain, uncovering the truth about St. Mary's would mean pulling at a thread woven into something far bigger and far more dangerous than a single lost patient. And with each step forward, the walls of silence seemed to close tighter around him. By midsummer, Whitaker knew that paper and whispers would only take him so far. If the truth about St. Mary's had been buried, then it was buried in the building itself. The walls, the floors, the locked doors, those were the real records no one had been able to destroy. On a gray afternoon, he drove up the long, winding road that led to the hospital. The structure emerged slowly through the trees, its red brick mottled with black mold, its windows shattered like hollow eyes. The closer he came, the more the air seemed to thicken. Even before stepping out of his car, Whitaker understood why. Locals called it cursed. The gates were chained but rusted. He climbed them easily, boots scraping against iron that groaned under his weight. Inside the courtyard, weeds had grown waist-high, cracking through the pavement, curling around old benches where patients once sat under supervision. The front doors were bolted shut, but a side entrance gaped open, its wood splintered by decades of trespassers. Whitaker pulled a flashlight from his jacket, clicked it on, and stepped into the dark. The smell hit him first, a mix of mildew, rust, and something faintly sweet, like rot long absorbed into the plaster. The beam of his flashlight swept across peeling walls and a tangle of collapsed ceiling tiles. His footsteps echoed, unnervingly loud in the cavernous silence. Everywhere he looked, time seemed frozen. An overturned wheelchair lay rusting against the wall. Patient charts, warped from water damage, littered the floor. In one room, he found a row of iron-framed beds, mattresses reduced to lumps of wire, and dust, yet the bed frames still lined up with military precision, as if waiting for occupants who had never returned. But it was the walls that unsettled him most. As he moved deeper into the north wing, he noticed places where the brickwork looked newer than the surrounding plaster. Solid stretches of red brick without door frames, where architectural plans would have shown passageways. Some sections bore faint chalk marks, circles, and arrows left by construction crews long forgotten. One even had a date scrawled in paint. August 1965. Whitaker ran his hand across the bricks. The mortar felt different, rougher, as if laid in haste. The wall had no purpose he could see. No support beam, no structural meat. It was simply there, blocking whatever lay beyond. He remembered the words of the retired orderly, "Walls going up overnight." The thought sent a chill crawling down his spine. As he pressed further, Whitaker found graffiti left by trespassing teenagers, crude symbols, names scrawled in spray paint, warnings like "Don't go farther" and voices inside. He dismissed them at first as urban legend theatrics. But then he found something that made his hand tighten on the flashlight. In one corner of the blocked hallway, half hidden beneath a pile of plaster, was a patient's identification bracelet. The paper tag had yellowed and the ink had nearly faded, but under the light, he could just make out the name. Michael Dew, his uncle. Whitaker crouched, staring at the fragile scrap of paper. It could have been coincidence, a relic left behind by chance. But here, wedged against the wall that shouldn't exist, it felt like a message. A trace, proof that Michael had been here, and that he had not left the way the hospital claimed. The weight of it pressed on him. He slipped the bracelet into a small evidence bag from his pocket, sealing it with hands that trembled more than he wanted to admit. Somewhere in these ruins, behind those unnatural walls, was the truth his father had carried in silence. And Whitaker wasn't leaving without finding it. But as he turned to leave, a flashlight beam cutting across the corridor, he froze. A shadow moved at the far end of the hall. For a moment, he thought it was a trick of light. But the sound followed. The soft scuff of a shoe against debris. Someone else was in the hospital with him. Whitaker called out, his voice echoing back through the empty wing. Silence answered. The shadow was gone. Heart pounding, he retraced his steps quickly, every nerve on edge. He had come looking for answers. But it was clear now. He wasn't the only one who knew St. Mary's still held secrets. Whitaker didn't sleep that night. He spread his notes across the kitchen table, the way he always did with old cases. Photographs, transcripts, scraps of testimony. But this time, the centerpiece was the fragile evidence bag containing his uncle's identification bracelet. The paper tag was torn at the edges, stained with years of dust, yet unmistakable. Michael W. Ghost made tangible. It wasn't enough to solve anything, but it was more proof than anyone in his family had ever held in 40 years. And if that bracelet had survived sealed behind a wall, then perhaps more had been hidden, waiting. But his mind kept circling back to the shadow. Someone had been in the hospital with him. Maybe just a trespassing teenager or someone chasing. Ghost stories. But Whitaker knew the difference between chance and presence. Whoever it was hadn't run, hadn't spoken, hadn't tried to frighten him. They had simply watched. And that unsettled him more than anything he had found in the ruins. The next morning, he drove to a nursing home on the outskirts of town. Alice Rowe, the former nurse who had once agreed to meet him before backing out, lived there under the care of her daughter. This time, when Whitaker explained he had found something inside St. Mary's, her daughter reluctantly allowed him in. Alice was frail, her hair white, her eyes clouded but sharp when they fixed on the evidence bag in Whitaker's hand. He placed it gently on the table in front of her. "I think this belonged to my uncle," he said softly. He was admitted in 1965. He never came out. For a long time, Alice didn't speak. Then, with a trembling hand, she touched the plastic bag, her fingers brushing the faded ink. Tears welled in her eyes. "You shouldn't have gone in there," she whispered. Whitaker leaned forward. "Please, I need to know what happened." "My family deserves to know." Alice shook her head. "We were told never to speak of that night. Never. They came in suits, not doctors, not anyone from the staff. We were ordered out of the wing. When we came back, the patients were gone. Beds made, charts missing. It was like they had been erased." Her voice cracked, and she sank back into her chair, exhausted. Whitaker pressed gently, asking if she had seen who the men were, or where they took the patients. She closed her eyes, shaking her head again. "All I remember," she murmured, "is the sound. They were crying. And then, silence." Whitaker sat in stunned quiet. the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. On his way out, Alice's daughter caught his arm. "Whatever you're looking for," she said firmly, "stop. People still care about keeping it hidden. My mother has lived in fear for 40 years. Don't drag her back into it." Whitaker nodded, but inside, he knew he couldn't stop. Not now. Back in his car, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. On the windshield, tucked beneath the wiper blade, was a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully. 3 words were written in block letters. "Leave IT alone." No signature. No explanation. Just a warning. Whitaker sat back in the driver's seat, the note trembling in his hand. Whoever had been in the hospital with him, whoever had been watching, now knew exactly who he was, and they wanted him to stop. But instead of deterring him, the note only hardened his resolve. If people were still trying to silence the story of St. Mary's after all these years, then the truth was bigger and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And Whitaker was determined to uncover every hidden piece, no matter what it cost him. Whitaker didn't drive home after the warning note. He couldn't. His chest was tight, his mind burning with Alice Rowe's words. We were told never to speak of that night. That, paired with the fresh thread left on his windshield, made one truth impossible to ignore. Someone still cared deeply about keeping St. Mary's secrets hidden. And if they still cared after 40 years, then the hospital story wasn't just a family tragedy. It was something bigger. He steered his car instead to the county records office, a squat brick building that smelled of dust and paper. The clerk, a thin man with wire rim glasses, looked up as Whitaker entered with his police badge flashing in the dim light. "I need to see every building plan for St. Mary's," Whitaker said flatly. "Every revision, every draft, even the ones you're not supposed to hand out." The clerk hesitated, then disappeared into the back. Minutes later, Whitaker was unrolling thick tubes of parchment across a long oak table, their edges curling stubbornly upward. He laid out the plans side by side, one from 1960, another from 1963, another dated April 1965, just months before the vanishings. His eyes scanned the neat lines of the hospital, the wards, the courtyards, the tunnels beneath. That was when he saw it. In the 1965 draft, penciled faintly in the margin, was a rectangular extension branching off the north wing. No label, no measurements. Just a ghostly outline with a single note beside it. Proposed additional ward, pending approval. Whitaker's pulse quickened. By October of that same year, another blueprint had replaced it. The ghost extension was gone, the margin erased clean. It was as though Ward C had never even been considered. Yet, Whitaker had stood in those hallways. He had seen the sealed walls with his own eyes. And Alice had spoken of being ordered out of a wing on the very night his uncle disappeared. The puzzle pieces slid together like teeth in a lock. Ward C had existed. Briefly, secretly, in a space between approval and erasure. And when the patients vanished, so did the records. But someone had left a crack, that penciled outline. Enough to prove he wasn't imagining it. He copied the plans into his notebook. Every line, every margin note. Hours passed unnoticed. By the time Whitaker stepped out of the records office, the sky was dimming to violet. He drove home with the windows down, letting the night air cool his racing thoughts. But as he turned onto his street, his stomach knotted. The same car from before, the one that had idled outside his apartment, was back, parked 2 doors down, engine off, headlights dark. Whitaker pulled into his driveway slowly, deliberately. He didn't look toward the car, didn't acknowledge it, but as he stepped inside his apartment, he felt the weight of unseen eyes following him. He spread the blueprints across his kitchen table next to the bracelet, the warning note, Alice's words. Piece by piece, the story was sharpening. St. Mary's had a wing it never admitted to building. A ward erased before it was ever officially real. And if Whitaker's instincts were right, that was where the patients had been taken. But there was still no proof. Nothing he could show anyone that would hold up in court. And that was when he realized the proof might not come from him at all. because the hospital was scheduled for demolition within months. Crews would be breaking through walls whether anyone wanted them to or not. And when they did, Whitaker knew what they would find. Whitaker couldn't stop thinking about the erased blueprint. The faint pencil lines haunted him, proof that Ward C had once been considered real, even if every official trace had been wiped away. But the blueprints alone weren't enough. He needed people, voices from that era who could confirm what paper had tried to erase. So, over the next week, he dug into old staff rosters. He called numbers that hadn't rung in decades, mailed letters that came back stamped address unknown, and knocked on doors of houses where the curtains never moved. Most of the time, he was silent. Sometimes he slammed the door. And then, one evening, his phone rang back. The caller's voice was gravelly, cautious. "You're looking into St. Mary's," the man said. Not as a question, but as a statement. "Who is this?" Whitaker asked. "Doesn't matter, but I was there. Maintenance staff. They told us we were building a new wing, but..." The voice trailed off, as though second-guessing itself. Then it returned, lower, tighter. "We weren't allowed to ask questions. Just haul supplies in, stack bricks, seal it off." "What kind of supplies?" Whitaker pressed. A pause. Then, almost a whisper. "Not hospital supplies. Locks, metal bars. Things that didn't belong in a place of healing." Whitaker's grip on the phone tightened. "Ward C?" he asked. The line went silent. For a moment he thought the man had hung up. Then came the reply. "Don't say that name again. And don't call me back." Click. The dial tone hummed in Whitaker's ear. He sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the phone. Every answer he found only cracked open more questions. Restraints, locks, sealed corridors. What had St. Mary's been hiding? That night, he laid out the blueprints, the bracelet, the testimony, Alice Rowe's warning, and now the cryptic words of the maintenance man. He drew lines between them, the way investigators map out conspiracies. The pattern was clear. Ward C wasn't a rumor. It had been real, built with secrecy, sealed with intention, and wiped from history. But one question gnawed at him most of all. If 23 patients, including his uncle, had been hidden away in a ward no one was supposed to know existed, then where had they gone? The next morning, Whitaker drove out to the edge of town, where the chain-link fence still surrounded the skeletal ruins of St. Mary's. A demolition notice was stapled to the gate. Crews were scheduled to begin within weeks. He stood there for a long time, gripping the cold steel of the fence. Behind it, the hospital loomed like a tombstone against the gray sky. For decades, the truth had been buried behind those walls. Soon, the walls themselves would come down, and Whitaker had the sinking feeling that when they did, the entire town would have to face what it had spent 40 years trying to forget. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and restless questions. Whitaker lived with the case spread across his kitchen table. Papers, photographs, maps, fragments of testimony. It looked less like research and more like an obsession. Lines of ink connecting names to places, dates to disappearances. Everything orbiting the faint word at the center. Ward C, but obsession has a cost. And soon, Whitaker began to feel it pressing in on him. At first, it was subtle. The same car parked too often across from his apartment. The feeling of eyes tracking him in grocery aisles. A call that rang once and hung up before he answered. Then it became undeniable. One night, as he returned home, he noticed his front door wasn't fully closed. He drew his gun before stepping inside, every nerve on edge. The apartment was silent, but his files were no longer where he'd left them. The blueprints he had copied were stacked neatly, too neatly, as if someone had thumbed through them and put them back with deliberate care. On his kitchen table, beside the stack of papers, lay a single Polaroid. It showed the north wing of St. Mary's, taken years earlier when the hospital was still alive with patients. In the corner of the photo, a door stood where the sealed wall would later be. Scrawled across the bottom margin in thick black marker were 3 words: "Stay outside." Whitaker stared at it for a long time, his pulse hammering in his throat. Whoever was leaving him these warnings wasn't trying to scare him into silence. They were trying to keep him out. But why? To protect him, or to protect themselves. The next morning, he carried the Polaroid into the precinct and showed it to a colleague. "You should file this," the man said, pushing it back across the desk. "But if you want my advice, drop it. St. Mary's has been dead for decades. Don't dig up ghosts." Whitaker pocketed the photo without replying, because the truth was, the ghosts had already been dug up. He had the bracelet. He had Alice Rowe's words. He had the erased blueprints. And in a matter of weeks, when the demolition crews began tearing down the hospital brick by brick, they would have no choice but to expose what had been buried. Still, he couldn't shake the sense of time running out. If someone was already inside those ruins, tampering with files, leaving warnings, then perhaps they knew what the crews were about to uncover. And perhaps they were desperate to keep it sealed. Whitaker drove out to St. Mary's again that evening, parking just outside the chain-link fence. The hospital loomed in the distance, its windows shattered, its roof sagging like a beast on its last breath. For a long time, he stood in the fading light, listening. The wind stirred through the trees. Metal siding groaned against the frame. And beneath it all, faint but undeniable, came another sound. It wasn't the crash of debris or the skitter of animals. It was rhythmic, deliberate. The echo of footsteps inside the sealed wing. Whitaker gripped the fence tighter. Somewhere behind those walls, someone was moving, not in the open, not in the places teenagers explored with flashlights, but deep inside the very sections that had been bricked away. And for the first time, Whitaker realized the demolition wouldn't just uncover a hidden ward. It might also expose whoever had been guarding it in the dark all these years. Whitaker felt the walls tightening around him, though he was miles away from St. Mary's. The case no longer lived only inside the crumbling hospital. It was seeping into his everyday life, filling his apartment, shadowing his footsteps, bending every conversation into suspicion. The Polaroid, the warnings, the car idling at night, they all pointed to one thing. Somebody still guarded the secret of 1965. And that meant the truth was alive, not buried. He tried to push forward methodically, the way he had with other cold cases. Cross-reference, timeline, motive. But this wasn't like the murders and robberies he had spent a career untangling. Those crimes had suspects, evidence, beginnings, and endings. This was different. This was absence. An entire wing that officially didn't exist. 24 patients who were never officially recorded as dead. His own uncle erased it in a column of ink. And in a matter of days, the hospital would be demolished. Whitaker drove out again to the site, this time in broad daylight. A demolition company had already posted signs, bright orange stakes driven into the ground to mark the boundaries. Heavy machinery sat idle nearby, their arms silhouetted against the sagging roofline. Soon they would swing into motion, tearing through bricks and mortar that had stood for nearly a century. He pressed against the chain-link fence, scanning the hospital's facade. The north wing, where the walls had been hastily sealed, where the graffiti screamed warnings, stood in sharp relief, sunlight catching the mismatched brickwork. Behind that wall, he knew, lay the truth. But what if the crews went in and found nothing? What if decades of rumors collapsed into dust, leaving him with nothing but fragments and paranoia? A gust of wind carried the faint smell of mildew, and with it, the echo of a sound he couldn't place, like a door shutting deep inside the building. He stood frozen, watching. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw movement at one of the upper windows. Just a flicker, a curtain swaying where there should have been none. He wasn't the only one waiting for demolition day. That evening, Whitaker returned to his files. He spread out everything again, tracing connections, searching for an angle he might have missed. In the center of it all, the Polaroid photo stared. Back at him, the handwritten command in black ink, "Stay outside." He thought of Alice Rowe's trembling words, of the maintenance man's whispers about prison gear. He thought of his Uncle Michael's bracelet, sealed away as if someone wanted it preserved for him to find. Every instinct told him he was standing on the edge of something massive, not just a family mystery, but a scandal that reached beyond one hospital, beyond one town. And yet, there was nothing more he could do. Not until the first wall came down. Whitaker exhaled, long and weary, and for the first time in weeks, allowed himself to lean back in his chair. The weight of 40 years pressed against him. He had followed every lead, knocked on every door, uncovered every scrap of testimony. Now the rest was out of his hands. In the morning, the demolition crews would arrive, and whatever St. Mary had hidden since 1965 would no longer stay buried. The morning the demolition began, the sky hung low with gray clouds, the kind that made the air feel heavy, as though the town itself understood what was about to happen. Whitaker stood at the edge of the construction site, a heart borrowed from the foreman perched awkwardly on his head. He had fought for weeks to be here, citing both his experience and his family's history, until the county finally relented and gave him clearance. Still, he knew there were eyes watching, people who wanted him nowhere near this. The crews moved with slow precision, their machines groaning to life. Excavators rolled forward, steel arms rising against the cracked brickwork of St. Mary's Hospital. The walls that had stood silent for 40 years shuddered under the first blow. Dust plumed into the morning air, a ghost rising from the ruins. Whitaker braced himself as the excavator bucket struck again, bricks crumbling, mortar giving way. The north wing groaned, beams creaking in protest. Each strike echoed like a heartbeat, faster, louder, until finally, the wall gave way. The excavator's arm punched through into open space, bricks collapsing inward instead of out. Workers shouted, pulling the machines back, dust pouring like smoke from the opening. One of the men signaled, voice muffled through his respirator. "There's a room back there." Whitaker's pulse spiked. He stepped closer, gripping the chain-link fence until the wire bit into his palms. He could see it now. Not rubble, not collapsed stone, but a hollow, a void that had been sealed away deliberately. The foreman called the machines to stop. Crews moved in with hand tools, clearing the jagged edges brick by brick. The hole widened, revealing a yawning darkness behind it. The air that seeped out was stale, sour, the smell of confinement long buried. Whitaker's stomach turned, but his feet carried him forward, past the warnings, past the foreman's raised hand. He ducked through the gap, flashlight in hand. The beam cut across the room inside, a narrow ward lined with rusting bed frames, restraints still bolted to the rails. On the far wall, faint chalk scrawls spelled words in shaky hands. "Let US out. God help you." Whitaker froze. The graffiti wasn't just vandalism. It was desperation, trapped inside. He swung the light across the floor. Scattered papers lay where they had fallen decades ago, brittle and curled with age. He crouched, lifting one carefully. It was a patient chart, the ink faded but still legible enough to read a date. August 13th, 1965, his uncle's admission year. Another paper caught his eye, crumpled in the corner. He unfolded it, hands trembling. A list of names, 23 in total. Each name marked with a single word in the margin. Moved, no destination. No further notes. Behind him, one of the workers muttered nervously, "This wasn't supposed to be here." Whitaker didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat had gone dry. He turned slowly, sweeping the beam wider. Beyond the first chamber stretched a corridor, its walls lined not with beds, but with doors. Heavy steel doors, each with a number stenciled in fading paint. C1, T3, C5. Ward C, the room wasn't just a sealed wing. It was the entrance. Whitaker stepped back into the doorway, staring at the line of cells stretching into the dark. His chest tightened. This wasn't a hospital ward at all. This was something else. Something meant to be hidden. The foreman's voice cut through the silence. "We should call this in. Get the county here." But Whitaker shook his head, gripping the papers tighter. The county had known once before. They had erased it. And if he let them take over now, Ward C would vanish again, buried under bureaucracy and silence. Not this time. Whitaker raised his flashlight toward the corridor, its beam swallowed quickly by the dark. He knew what came next. The sealed wing had been opened, but the real answers and the real dangers still lay ahead. Whitaker ducked deeper through the jagged opening, his flashlight beam slicing into the corridor beyond. The moment his boots touched the floor of Ward C, he knew this wasn't like any other part of a hospital. The air was different here. Heavy, stagnant, sharp with the tang of rust and mold. It clung to his skin, made each breath feel like inhaling dust from a forgotten grave. Even the silence seemed thicker, not the empty silence of abandonment, but the kind that lingered after screams had long since died away. His light passed over the first of the steel doors. The paint was chipped, the number faint but still visible. C1. A square viewing slot had been welded shut from the outside. The handle was thick, industrial, more suited to a prison block than a hospital ward. Whitaker tried the door. It didn't budge. He crouched lower, shining his beam at the bottom edge where rust had eaten through the frame. Faint scratch marks scarred the tile floor, dozens of them, radiating outward like claw marks, as though someone had tried to dig their way out with bare hands. A chill crept up his spine. He moved on. C3, C5, each one the same. Heavy steel, welded slots, locks meant to hold. Some doors bore dents from the inside, as if fists or heads had struck them again and again. On others, words had been scratched. Into the paint, desperate, uneven. Mother, please, let me out. The deeper Whitaker went, the worse it became. His light caught fragments scattered across the floor. A slipper hardened with age. Scraps of paper too brittle to read. The twisted remains of restraints. He picked one up, leather cracked and stiff, the metal buckle corroded. It was sized not for an adult, but for a child. Whitaker's stomach tightened. They hadn't only confined adults here. At the far end of the corridor, the beam of his flashlight revealed something larger, a wide steel door, heavier than the rest, its handle bolted shut. Above it, the word observation had been stenciled in faded black paint. He approached slowly, every step crunching on plastered dust and glass. His pulse hammered in his ears. This door was different, not just a cell, but something central, a place meant to be watched, controlled. He pressed his ear against the cold metal. Nothing. Just the hollow thud of silence. And yet, the hair along his arms rose as though something were listening on the other side. Whitaker lifted his flashlight again, sweeping it across the wall beside the door. That was when he saw it. A message scrolled in faded chalk, barely visible through the decades of dust. They never left. He froze. The words weren't just eerie. They were impossible. The patients had vanished in 1965, erased from the records, declared gone. But here, written by a desperate hand, was a direct contradiction. Whitaker felt the paper list in his pocket. 23 names, moved, scrawled beside each one. Where? Moved into here? And if so, had they ever left at all? Behind him, the workers muttered nervously. One of them refused to come farther, muttering about the smell, about the scratches on the walls. Another crossed himself and backed away toward the gap. But Whitaker couldn't move. His beam lingered on those 3 words, his chest tightening. They never left. What did it mean? Were the patients still here, their bodies hidden in the walls? Or was it something worse, that they had been kept alive, unseen, long after the world thought them gone? Whitaker's hands shook as he lowered the flashlight. The sealed wing had answered one question, but it had opened a dozen more. And somewhere beyond that steel observation door, he knew, lay the most dangerous answer of all. Whitaker stood frozen in the corridor, staring at the chalk scrawl. They never left. The words burrowed under his skin, their meaning shifting. With every second, he let them echo in his mind. His breath clouded faintly in the stale air. The others behind him muttered, their nerves fraying with each passing moment. But Whitaker couldn't turn back now. He had spent years piecing together fragments of a story everyone else wanted forgotten. And here, in the sealed artery of St. Mary's, he was closer than anyone had been in 4 decades. Slowly, he approached the steel door. Observation, the fading paint declared in letters that seemed too clinical for a place so cruel. The closer he drew, the more he noticed the details. the rust blooming like scars across the hinges. The padlock corroded, but still intact. The faint impression of fingerprints worn into the steel handle as if countless hands had gripped it. In terror, he slipped on his gloves, crouched, and ran the beam of his flashlight across the floor beneath the door. Dust lay thick, but it wasn't uniform. A faint gap, almost like a draft, whispered out from the other side. And within that draft was the smell. Not just rot, not just rust. Something chemical, acrid, the ghost of medicines and solvents that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Whitaker's pulse hammered. He knew what he had to do. He pulled the crowbar from his bag and wedged it against the rusted lock. Metal groaned. Sparks spat as he pried, sweat breaking along his hairline despite the cold. Each strike of the crowbar echoed like a gunshot in the narrow corridor, the sound bouncing back at him magnified. His hands burned, muscles trembling, but he didn't stop. Behind him, one of the workers called nervously, "We should wait for the county. This isn't safe." Whitaker didn't look back. "If we wait," he said, gritting his teeth, "this door will be buried again, and so will the truth." With one last heave, the lock snapped free, clattering to the ground. The sound rang out final, definitive. Whitaker paused, chest heaving, staring at the now unchained door. A strange stillness followed, as though the entire wing was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. He gripped the steel handle with both hands and pulled. The hinges screamed, stiff from years of neglect, and the door swung open reluctantly, as though fighting him even in its rusted state. A rush of air poured out, foul, heavy, suffocating. Whitaker gagged behind his respirator, stumbling back, the beam of his flashlight faltering in the cloud. When it cleared, he stepped forward, again forcing himself inside. The room stretched wider than he expected, a cavern of shadows. His flashlight beam skittered across the walls, catching glimpses that chilled him. Rows of tables lined the sides, each one bolted with restraints, their leather cracked but still coiled like waiting snakes. Metal trays rested beside them, holding surgical instruments dulled with rust. Glass vials littered the floor, their labels dissolved to smudges. Some still held liquid, congealed into sludge after 40 years of darkness. But it wasn't just the equipment. On one wall, still pinned under broken glass, hung yellow charts, anatomical sketches, nervous systems, diagrams of brains. Scribbled notes in jagged handwriting annotated them. Dosages, reactions, failures. Whitaker lifted one gingerly, his stomach tightening as he read the heading. Trial Group C. His light drifted lower, across the floor, and that was when he saw them. Not skeletons, no remains, but piles of personal effects, shoes, patient gowns, small belongings that had once meant something to someone. A rosary, a pocket watch, a hair ribbon stiff with dust. Each one catalogued in its own way, as if stripped from the patients who had passed through this room and discarded here like afterthoughts. Whitaker crouched, lifting the ribbon. The fabric crumbled in his gloved fingers, but the initials stitched faintly into the corner were still visible. His chest clenched. Michael Whitaker, his uncle. For a moment the room seemed to tilt, the air rushing louder in his ears. Proof. His uncle had been here, inside this room. He staggered back, gripping the ribbon as though it anchored him. His beam flickered toward the far corner of the room, where something loomed against the wall. A chair, larger than the others, bristling with wires that trailed into rusted consoles. An observation device, primitive but unmistakably designed for experiments, not treatment. Whitaker's breath caught. This wasn't a hospital ward. This wasn't healing. It was testing. His light froze on one final detail, a phrase painted crudely across the wall in black. The letters shaky, uneven, but unmistakable. They watched you. Whitaker's heart pounded. The sealed ward wasn't just about disappearance. It was about control, about experiments buried under the guise of medicine. And as he lowered the flashlight, a sudden sound broke the silence. A shuffle. From inside the room. Whitaker whipped the beam around, his chest tightening, but saw only empty tables, broken glass, and shadows. The sound came again, closer. Someone, or something, was still inside. Whitaker's flashlight beam shook as he swept it across the room, chasing the sound that had echoed in the stale air. The shuffle had been close, not imagined, not a trick of the building settling. He could feel it, the way silence stretched too tight afterward, the way every shadow seemed to lean forward. His pulse hammered, but he forced himself to steady. His breath. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice low, deliberate. Only silence answered. The beam of his light skittered across rusted tables and broken vials, over the crude wires still looped across the chair, across charts that whispered of experiments no hospital should have ever conducted. He knew the room was empty, at least empty of the living, but the weight of 40 years clung to every surface, every word scrawled into the walls, every belonging discarded like evidence that was never meant to be seen again. Whitaker backed toward the doorway, clutching the crumbling ribbon in his pocket as if it were a lifeline. His uncle's initials, still stitched into the fabric, pressed against his palm like a wound. When he finally stumbled out into the corridor, the air felt lighter, but his chest still heaved with the suffocating truth. Ward C had existed. Patients had been brought here, stripped of identity, experimented on, and erased. But why, and who had ordered it? He didn't go home that night. Instead, he drove straight to the county archive, packing under the dim orange glow of the street lamp. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the building, convincing himself he wasn't being followed before finally slipping. Inside, hours passed as he combed through reels of microfilm, pulling newspapers from the months before and after 1965. He wasn't just looking for the hospital anymore. He was looking for anything connected. Funding announcements, political speeches, grants for psychiatric research, and he found them. In the spring of 1965, a state senator had boasted of innovations in psychiatric treatment at St. Mary's, promising federal support for experimental methods. By midsummer, the articles stopped. By fall, the hospital was shuttered. The silence was almost surgical, as if someone had cut a vein and sealed it without leaving a scar. Whitaker leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. He had seen this pattern before, in other cases. Projects that began with fanfare, swallowed in silence when the truth grew too dark. But the silence had a shape. It wasn't absent. It was erased. The next morning, Whitaker began calling again. Retired nurses, orderlies, maintenance staff. He had tried before and been met with slammed phones and cold silence. But now, he had proof. Now he could tell them he had seen Ward C with his own eyes. Most hung up before he finished his first sentence. One cursed and threatened to report him. Another simply breathed heavily for several seconds, then whispered, "Stop digging," before ending the call. But late in the afternoon, one voice hesitated. Her name was Martha Keene, a nurse's aide in the 1960s, now living in a small house outside the county line. Her voice trembled when Whitaker mentioned Ward C, but she didn't hang up. "I was there the night they vanished," she admitted, her words spilling out like a confession too long carried. "I heard them, the patients, crying, screaming. We were told it was part of a transfer, but no one ever came out, and no one ever came back." Whitaker gripped the receiver tighter. "What did they tell you afterward?" Martha's voice cracked. "Nothing. They didn't have to. We were given papers to sign, told it was for confidentiality. But we knew. Everyone knew. We just couldn't say it." "Couldn't?" Whitaker pressed. "Or wouldn't?" Her silence answered him more than words. When she finally spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper. "You don't understand. People disappeared for less. Families lost jobs. My supervisor, he spoke up once, just once. He was found in the river 2 weeks later. They said it was an accident, but everyone knew it wasn't." Her breathing hitched. "Don't call me again." The line went dead. Whitaker lowered the phone, staring blankly at his notes. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had admitted. Ward C hadn't just been a hospital wing. It had been a place sanctioned, protected, buried under a system powerful enough to erase lives and silence witnesses for decades. He looked down at the ribbon in his pocket, then at the stack of names in his notebook. 23 patients, including his uncle. People who had been told they were being treated. People who had instead disappeared. Whitaker exhaled slowly, the weight of it pressing on him. For the first time, the truth wasn't just about his family. It was bigger. It was systemic. But the deeper he went, the clearer one thing became. Someone was still making sure the story stayed buried. Because when he returned home that night, his apartment door was ajar. He froze in the hallway, heart racing. Slowly, he pushed the door open. Inside, his notes were gone. Every page, every photograph, every scrap of evidence, stripped from his table, his desk, his drawers. The only thing left was the ribbon, still in his pocket. And on the bare kitchen table, written in thick black marker, were 3 words he had already seen once before. Leave it alone. Whitaker stood in the doorway of his own apartment, the silence louder than any threat. His notes were gone. Every photograph, every blueprint, every scrap of evidence he had painstakingly gathered had been stripped away in minutes. The table, where he had built his timeline, now sat bare, except for the warning scrawled in black marker. Leave it alone. His first instinct was anger. He wanted to storm down to the police station, file a report, demand an investigation. But then he thought of the sheriff who had brushed him off, the officials who had told him St. Mary's was a dead file. He thought of Alice Rowe, trembling in a nursing home bed, still afraid to speak after 40 years. He thought of Martha Keene, whispering of accidents that weren't accidents. He knew what the report would say if he filed one. Break-in. No suspects. Case closed. And the people who had taken his notes would know he had tried to go public. They would tighten the leash, maybe even cut it altogether. Whitaker locked the door and sat in the dark, the ribbon clutched in his hand. His uncle's initials pressed against his skin like a brand. That small piece of fabric was now the only proof he had left. Everything else was memory, and memory could be denied. That night he barely slept. Every creak in the hallway sounded like a step. Every car idling outside felt like surveillance. He got up 3 times to check the locks, once to peer through the blinds. Each time, the street looked empty, but the sense of being watched never left. By morning, exhaustion had settled into his bones, but so had resolve. If they wanted him to stop, it meant he was closer than ever. And if his notes had been taken, he would just start over. But the cost was already mounting. At work, colleagues began keeping their distance. A detective he trusted pulled him aside in the hallway and whispered, "You're drawing heat, Whitaker. People are saying you're obsessed. You don't want this sticking to your badge." His supervisor called him in too. "You're chasing ghosts," she warned, her tone sharp but laced with something like concern. "I know you've got a personal stake, but you need to walk away before it ruins your career. Cases like this, they don't end well." Whitaker left the office with her words echoing in his head, but when he opened his locker later, he found something else waiting. A single Polaroid photograph, grainy and dark, slipped between his files. It showed the outside of his apartment building, his own window circled in red ink. He crumpled the photo in his fist, breath catching in his throat. They weren't just watching. They wanted him to know they were watching. That night, his sister called. She lived 2 towns over, one of the last people who still spoke openly about their Uncle Michael. Her voice trembled when she said, "Someone came by the house today. They asked about you. Said they were doing a background check, but it didn't feel right. They asked if you had certain obsessions, if you'd ever acted unstable." Whitaker closed his eyes, the pieces slotting together. They weren't just trying to scare him. They were trying to isolate him, to make him look like the problem, the danger. That way, if something happened to him, no one would question it. The pressure built with each passing day. His phone clicked with static in the middle of calls. His car alarm went off at random hours of the night. His car alarm went off. Once, as he drove home, he caught headlights in his rearview mirror, following him for 20 miles before vanishing into the dark. But for every threat, every warning, his determination only sharpened. The truth was there, buried in the walls of St. Mary's. in the erased files and the silence of those who had lived through it. He had touched it, smelled it, seen it with his own eyes. And if he stopped now, then the people who had vanished, his uncle among them, would remain. Erased forever. One evening, as he sat at his bare kitchen table, he opened his notebook and began again. He read through the lines he remembered, rewriting names from memory, retracing the connections. His hand trembled, but his resolve didn't. At the center, he wrote 2 words in heavy ink, Ward C, and beneath it, he added another, observation, because that steel door, sealed tighter than the rest, had not been opened. Not yet. And Whitaker knew, in his bones, that whatever truth still lay behind it was the reason people were still watching him after 40 years. The cost of truth was rising, but so was the risk of walking away. He stared at the words until the ink blurred, his heart steadying into resolve. If Ward C was where the patients had disappeared, then the observation room was where the answers waited. And no threat, no photograph, no warning scrawled in marker would keep him from opening it. By autumn, the pressure around Whitaker had grown into something suffocating. Every knock on his door, every rustle outside his apartment, felt like the prelude to something final. He was being warned off from every angle, and yet, with every new shadow, every fresh threat, his conviction only deepened. The stolen notes had taught him one thing. The truth wasn't just dangerous. It was alive. Someone out there was still tending to it, still guarding it after all these years. And if that was the case, then he couldn't bury it, no matter what it cost him. He returned to St. Mary's one last time before winter closed the roads. By then, demolition crews had already begun gutting the south wing, their machines tearing into the plaster and beams, erasing history brick by brick. Whitaker stood at the chain-link fence, the November wind biting against his face, watching as the walls that had once held hundreds of patients fell into rubble. The north wing, the sealed one, was still standing. For now, he knew he wouldn't get another chance. Whitaker made his way around the perimeter under cover of dark, slipping past a weak spot in the fence where weeds had grown tall. He moved through the half-demolished halls like a man trespassing not just on property, but on memory itself. Thus floated in the air, stirred by the machinery left behind for the night. The silence was broken only by the distant creak of settling beams, and then he reached it. The corridor where the sealed bricks had stood, where the observation door waited. The crowbar in his hand felt heavier than ever. He set to work quickly, prying past the last layer of bricks that the construction crews had begun chipping away but hadn't finished. Each crack and thud echoed through the gutted hospital, loud, enough to wake ghosts. His arms shook with exhaustion, but he pressed on until the gap widened into an opening large enough to step through. The beam of his flashlight fell on the corridor of Ward C, still intact, still suffocating, still lined with doors that had not been opened in 40 years. He wasn't alone this time. 2 journalists he had quietly contacted, both local. Reporters with nothing to lose and everything to gain from a story like this had followed him in. They were skeptical at first, whispering about old ghost stories and paranoid legends. But the moment their light skimmed across the scratched words carved into the walls, their skepticism faltered. When they saw the restraints still bolted to the bed frames, their silence spoke louder than belief. God, one of them muttered, lowering his camera. This wasn't a hospital. This was a prison. Whitaker didn't answer. He led them deeper, past the numbered cells, until they stood before the heavy steel door, the one marked observation. His chest tightened. He had dreamt of this door, woken in the night thinking of it. For months it had loomed over his every note, his every theory. And now here it was, waiting, the lock rusted but still holding. Together, the 3 men worked at it, the sound of metal grating against metal filling the corridor. With one final strike, the lock gave way. The door groaned, swinging inward with a breath of air so foul it seemed to claw at their lungs. Flashlights swept the room. It wasn't empty. Charts lay scattered across tables, yellowed with time but still legible. In places, diagrams of nervous systems, skulls, notes in clipped handwriting. Along one wall, Restraints were still bolted to chairs, their leather straps cracked but intact. On another, shelves held jars of preserved specimens, their labels washed away, but their contents still grimly visible. And then there were the photographs. Piles of them, curling at the edges, showing patients in various stages of treatment. Some strapped down, some unconscious, some staring at the camera with vacant, pleading eyes. Dates were scribbled on the back, all from 1965. Whitaker felt his throat close. His uncle's face wasn't in the pile he sifted through, but the eyes of others, strangers, seemed to burn with the same question. Why? The journalists photographed everything, their cameras flashing in the dark. The images felt obscene, wrong, but necessary. If they didn't document it, it would vanish again, swallowed by silence and rubble. And then one of them called out, "Here, look at this." He held up a logbook, its cover warped with moisture. Whitaker flipped it open with trembling hands. Inside, in faded ink, were patient names. Some crossed out, others followed by notes. Transferred to Ward C, subject not returned. Observation continued. The last entry bore a date, August 14th, 1965. The very day the patients had vanished. It was proof. Not just rumors, not just whispers from the elderly who remembered, but written records. Whitaker's vision swam as he stared at the page. 40 years of silence, of questions without answers, and now the truth was bleeding through at last. His uncle's name wasn't among those listed. Not clearly, but the implications were undeniable. Patients had been moved, confined, erased from the hospital's official records. Ward C had been real, and the sealed room behind the observation door had been their tomb. The journalists were pale, shaken, but resolute. "This is it," one said. "This is the story. People need to see this." Whitaker nodded slowly. He felt no triumph, only gravity. The weight of lives cut short, of families left in the dark, of decades stolen. When the story broke days later, it swept through the community like wildfire. Headlines blared. Secret ward discovered in abandoned hospital. Patient records reveal. Cover-up. Families demand answers. Television crews arrived, their lights cutting across the ruins of St. Mary's. Families of the vanished gathered at the gates, holding photographs, their faces etched with both grief and vindication. Some wept openly. Others stood in silence, gripping signs that asked the same questions Whitaker had scrawled in his notebook. What happened in Ward C? Who was responsible? Officials scrambled. The county issued a statement calling the discovery unfortunate but historically inconclusive. The state deflected, citing lost records, misplaced accountability. No one admitted fault. But the photographs spoke louder than any denial. For the first time in 40 years, the vanished patients of St. Mary's were visible again. Their faces stared back from newspapers, from television screens, from the haunted walls of a hospital that had tried to erase them. And Whitaker, though shadowed, threatened, and left with more questions than answers, had forced their story into the light. Yet as he stood among the families at the gates, watching the cameras flash and the reporters shout, he couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at him. This wasn't the end. Because somewhere, beyond the rubble and the ruins, beyond the headlines and the official statements, the true story of what happened in Ward C, the experiments, the silence, the reason behind it all, was still buried. And the people who had tried to keep it hidden for 40 years weren't done yet. For weeks after the discovery of Ward C, the story dominated headlines. Reporters camped at the gates of St. Mary's. Families who had long since stopped hoping found themselves on television, clutching old photographs, speaking names that had not been spoken publicly in decades. For a moment, it seemed as if the silence of 40 years had finally broken. But as quickly as it rose, the storm began to fade. The demolition crews returned. The north wing was reduced to rubble. The ruins of Ward C, its cells, its observation room, its shelves of rotting evidence were hauled away in trucks and dumped out of sight. What had survived untouched for 40 years was erased in a matter of weeks. The state declared the discovery historical but inconclusive. No prosecutions followed. No names were named. Families received no letters, no apologies, no final answers. And yet something had shifted. Because the photographs remained. The logbooks remained. The headlines remained. What Whitaker had uncovered could no longer be denied, no matter how quickly officials tried to bury it again. Still, in the quiet moments, he wondered, how much had truly been revealed? The bracelet in his evidence bag, the photograph of his uncle standing in the courtyard, the faint voices he swore he had heard in the corridors, none of it told him where Michael had gone, or why 23 patients were taken that night in 1965. The records hinted at experiments, at observation, but they stopped short of explanation. The truth, as always, was left just beyond reach. At his desk, Whitaker pinned the last photograph to his board, a faded image of the hospital gates, taken the day after the discovery went public. Families stood behind the fence, some crying, some silent, all staring at the building that had swallowed their loved ones whole. He drew one final line across the board, connecting it all together. Then he stepped back, staring at the web of faces, documents, maps, and notes. It told a story, yes, but not the whole story. And as he turned off the light in his office, Whitaker knew that the missing patients of St. Mary's would never leave him. Their names, their faces, their silence would linger in every corner of his mind, as permanent as the scratches carved into those hidden walls. The case remained closed. The truth remained unfinished. And for the families who had waited for decades for answers, there was only one certainty. Their loved ones had entered St. Mary's in 1965, and they had never come out again.